Hi, great to see you all. I'm David Mayer. I'm the author of Fortune's Datasheet technology newsletter. Please all sign up. And my life has just become all about AI recently, which is a shift I think we can see represented here at the scheduled Web Summit. And what is it doing to our industry, I ask? We have some of the top figures of the credible media, I would say, who must struggle with the carnage that AI is going to be wreaking. I'm slightly over-dramatizing things. Julie, let's start with you. Before we get to the issue of what the news consumer should look out for, what are you doing within Associated Press about AI? Is it something you're approaching very cautiously? Is it something you're embracing? Where are you at?
I would say we're somewhere in the middle. I mean, one of the things I always remind people within the AP, but also externally as well, is that we've actually been working with AI at AP for about 10 years. Now, it's not the generative AI that we're all talking about right now, but it has been for things that have been really positive for our journalists. Things like being able to automate stock tables and sports reports and freeing up journalists to do more ambitious work that really requires a human being to be at the helm there. So we have a great example over the last decade of being able to use AI and not cut jobs, which is the big thing that I think a lot of journalists are fearful of. I do think we're in a phase right now, though, where the technology is so much more advanced that I think we're having to have a lot of internal conversations about how we create literacy within our own news organization, about knowing what the technology is capable of, how to spot what the technology is creating. You know, we can't inform our audiences about what's real and what's not, about what to look for, unless we know how to do that internally as well. And so a lot of what we've been doing over these last couple of months is really developing internal frameworks, internal standards, sharing them with the rest of the industry, because we think that's an important role for the AP to play here, to set those standards for the rest of the industry. And the response has been really positive, because I think one of the things I'm pleased about is that you do see the media largely right now, I think, saying, we have to be part of this conversation. You know, we can't let this all wash over us. We have to help try to drive and dictate where this goes. But again, that starts with creating that literacy inside our own organization.
And Yasir?
Well, as a newsroom, I think the question that we ask ourselves at the Thomson Reuters Foundation is how do we add meaningfully to the conversation about generative AI that is happening right now within our audience of, and we have a very specific audience. Our audience is purpose-driven professionals, so people who work in policy, who work in government, who work at the United Nations, diplomacy, academia. And our conversation internally is how to tap into that, or how to speak to those people and add meaningfully to the conversation that they're already having. So, for instance, one of our first stories on AI that we did this year was, what is AI and is it going to take away my job? And that is a big question that a lot of people within our audience had been asking. And from there, our sort of focus is telling the stories of people at the sharp end of policies or phenomenon, like climate change, for instance. And so we have centered our coverage around how is this whole sort of burgeoning of generative AI and this global discovery of the things that it can do, how does it impact ordinary people? Last year we did this amazing investigation, our correspondent in San Francisco, Avi Shapiro, about large language models being used in the American prison system to surveil prisoners and people who came to visit them. And so what we're doing is keeping an eye on the development of AI, and also we are also tapping into where is it being used in ways that require accountability. And so that's been sort of the focus of our coverage in digital rights, data privacy, surveillance, socioeconomic inequality that AI would create. The coders, for instance, who were paid exploitative rates to program AI engines. So that's where our focus is.
It's an interesting point. And before we get to the media literacy side, do you think that the amount of coverage of AI, or do you think that the tone of the coverage of AI at the moment is tends to be negative because it feels like a bit of a counterpoint, perhaps, to the boosterism on the other side?
Not necessarily. I think, I don't know in your experience, but there's, among our readers, I think AI is a topic of conversation because people know very little about it. And those who do know about it are on both sides of the divide. There are those who are using it for nefarious purposes, but then there are also those who are using it for things like climate modeling, or crunching large amounts of data to pull out, data journalists using, using AI to crunch data to pull out stories that they wouldn't otherwise be able to tell. So I don't think the coverage of AI has been negative. I know my Twitter feed or my X feed is inundated with, here's how you can use AI to do this, and so that I roll my eyes at. But I don't think the conversations have fallen on any one side.
And I think AI coverage is not one thing. It's coverage of the technology,
Exactly.
but it's coverage of governments and regulations. It's coverage of positive use cases and negative use cases. I mean, it's so wide-ranging right now that I think one of the things we've been talking about internally is how do we make sure that AI is kind of part of every coverage area that we have. We see stories coming up from sports and entertainment. If you look at the Hollywood strikes, that's been a lot about what the risks of AI could be. So I don't think there's sort of any one area where you can sort of pigeonhole it, and I think we all have to become internal experts in order to have it infused throughout the coverage.
Just like climate change, right? Like climate change is now part, if you pick up a newspaper, climate change is on the front page, climate change is on the finance pages, on the real estate pages, the comic section, and the crossword. And I think AI is permeating in that way, except we've lived with the climate change conversation for a very, very long time. We've just started having the AI conversation at a popular level. And so I think that's, it's smart to look at those opportunities. Where can we have an AI conversation that really matters in our coverage?
Mm-hmm. One of the themes that's been running through this entire conference so far has been that of trust and AI. Are you feeling that? I mean, you're two extremely well-established, authoritative organizations. Are you feeling that a lack of trust bleeding through as far as you so far, or?
Not so far, which is good. But I think this is where, as a media organization, you say, okay, that's our place then, right? I mean, we have to maintain that trusted position, because I think what we are going to see, even though I do believe that there are really positive use cases for generative AI, both in the media industry and outside, we are going to see more misinformation, as we just are. There's no way around it. And so I think we, as a news organization, have to say, our role is to be able to provide you trusted, accurate, real information. And holding to that position, making sure that we don't do anything that knocks us off of that position, I think becomes more essential than ever. And also, hopefully, again, as we build kind of that internal literacy around AI, being that place that can also be a clearinghouse. When something significant happens that is AI-generated misinformation, we want to be able to tell you not just that it's misinformation or that it's a false creation, why, how we know it, being able to be transparent about that, I think will be really, really crucial.
At Thomson Reuters, and by extension at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we have these things called the trust principles, which is independence, integrity, and freedom from bias. And I think the brand has sort of held on to those and exhibited those consistently over a very long period of time, to the point where the brand recognition for trusted information is there. I mean, people make major economic and financial decisions based on Thomson Reuters info, right? So there's that. But I was speaking to our team recently about the trust principles, because we talk about them frequently, and I was saying to them that they're once a weapon and a shield, where they protect us from even the suspicion of going wayward on something, and they have established trust within our audiences about, we will triple, quadruple check things before we tell it to you, and at the same time, a weapon as in, we can, with that truthful, fair, accurate, independent information, we can affect a lot of impact in the world, right? And so I think in that sense, folks like you guys and we, because of a history of doing things in a certain way, are shielded from a lot of the flack. I do worry about the smaller newsrooms.
I was about to come to that.
Because they, A, don't have the brand recognition, B, they don't have systems in place that, help them do that kind of due diligence on a photograph or a piece of video or, a piece of text. And I do worry about those guys.
And this is actually one of the things that we're working on, particularly in the United States, is trying to help local newsrooms. We have a local AI initiative because I think you're so right. I mean, if we're struggling as large, well-established news organizations, how are local news organizations going to be able to get their arms around this? So we're trying to actually partner with them, help them with the tools, but also help them find the ways that they can use the technology. I mean, if you're in a small local newsroom anywhere in the world, you're probably going through a staffing shortage. You probably have fewer journalists than you used to. Can you use the technology to actually fill some of those gaps? I think that's again, a really positive part of this conversation that we should be having.
But we're seeing not just a shift that we saw with social media, perhaps, where it simply went to smaller news organizations being able to get their names out there. But we're now seeing individuals becoming news organizations in their own right. I was just chatting to a TikToker who's a TikTok news reader, and I'll be honest, 6 months ago, I didn't even know that was a thing. And I'm still struggling to get my head around it. But there's a whole generation that is consuming their news this way. People in that position would perhaps find it a lot easier as a one-person operation to employ AI. I mean, what advice would you give to smaller news organizations and even individuals who want to have some of that authority that your organizations have spent years building? How do you do it?
The same advice I would give to journalists in our newsroom. Make sure you get it right. Make sure you get it right, because a reputation is something that is easier to acquire and difficult to shake. So if you want to survive as a TikTok news presenter and a journalist, that's totally fine. You can do that. There's 3.5 billion people on the internet. All I want is 100 million. So you can have the rest, but you make sure you get it right, because that's where you don't want to screw up.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that I'm very supportive. I think we all should be supportive of individual creators being able to have a platform. And personally, I've used that to find stories, angles that maybe we're not reflecting. If there's a big audience for a certain story or a certain topic and it's not part of our news report, then we're not actually meeting the needs of our audiences, right? Because we have such a broad audience. So I think it's been a great kind of tool for us to see where the conversation is going. But as an individual creator, as a smaller outlet, I wouldn't say that you could replicate the reputation of a large established news organization. You also shouldn't try. I mean, that's not your goal, is to try to kind of recreate what we have at Reuters, Thomson Reuters, or at the AP. But it just comes down to trust with the audience that you do have. That is the most essential thing. And so if you can use AI or any new technology to help you further that trust, amazing. But if you use it in a way that's going to erode that, I think to your point, there's really not a way to get that back then.
Yeah.
There was recently, just last week, I think, a scandal with an image that was generated by Adobe's image generator, purporting to show an explosion over Gaza, and it was AI generated. It was nonsense, but it got picked up by a lot of smaller news organizations. People will have seen that. They will have seen the fallout from that. Do you think we're going to enter a real crisis of trust, that people simply don't believe anything they see?
Well, a long time ago, and by a long time I mean about a decade ago, I had a conversation with my dad about sharing misinformation on the family WhatsApp group. And I'd said to him, Dad, you're a journalist's father. You need to consider what you're doing. And my dad said something really interesting to me. He said, you know what, when we were growing up, it took a lot of effort and fact-checking and, it took a lot of doing to get something published with this level of production value. So when it got to us looking beautiful and on glossy paper, we believed it because it had gone through so many hands that were trustworthy. But now, the user interface of even a disinformation website is spectacular. So I think, yes, I do worry about it, but I think, as large news organizations, I think we have the capacity to build those defenses, to build those, to acquire people with the skill set who can be that intermediary where something comes in and you verify. And also, look, we are blessed to be large enough that we have our own people doing the work. So we would much rather prefer publishing what we generate as opposed to user-generated content, which is so dicey. It's so dicey, and you can no longer get away with the disclaimer, we could not independently verify this. You can now, right? You have OSINT capabilities that you can use to verify a load of things. So I think I'm less worried about that, and I'm more worried about what are we teaching what are our consumers learning outside of watching the news, right? Like about how to consume the news, about how to be critical consumers of the news. I was reading my daughter's textbooks, and there's really very little in there about being a savvy news consumer. And she's the daughter of a journalist and a PR strategist. She needs to know. And so I think I would treat media literacy and literacy, especially about AI and disinformation, as a public education and a public health issue where it should be up to governments and policymakers to really think about what are we teaching the kids in high schools and elementary schools so that they grow into savvy consumers of the news.
I agree with that because I think we are talking a lot about what we can do to be transparent, to be able to say, this is why this photo that we've taken is legitimate because we can prove that there was a photographer behind it who was in this location. And here's a little bit about them. And here's the other work that they've been doing from this space. So you can, okay, fine. You can trust that this is a real image generated by an AP journalist. What I can't do, though, is make sure that the person on the receiving end of that information is taking the time to say, how do I know that's real and that's not, right?
Yeah.
Arming people with the tools to be able to make those decisions themselves on where they're going to get their information, what questions they're going to ask, what sources they're going to seek out. We have a role in providing that information to people and educating them about this. Then there is that public responsibility aspect. And I think that's really important. And I think sometimes we don't talk enough about the responsibility of the news consumer to make sure that they are making good, smart, educated choices about where they're getting their information. But we can play a role in helping make sure that, again, they have that toolkit at their disposal.
And I think educating the public from a very, very young age on being better consumers of news just builds better societies and makes societies probably that are immune to a lot of the disinformation because they're smart consumers of news. And I think this how to watch television is just as much of a skill as how to make television sometimes.
I mean, we're at a point at the moment where you could still go, well, actually, 6 months ago, you could still go, look at the hands. Are the fingers the right length? Are there enough fingers, etc.? Already, that's taken care of in most cases with the latest image generator versions. Let's just take it as read that in a year's time, it will be indistinguishable. Do you think we're going to have to turn to AI to prove that something is AI or disprove it? And is that going to have to be part of media literacy?
It's a great question. Do you use AI to police AI, right? I mean, and I think there are other players involved in this too. I mean, I think that we also have to be honest about what our limitations as a news industry and what our responsibilities here are, right? I mean, I think there are certainly roles for the tech companies, the social platforms, for who could be providing the platform for this information to be spread. I mean, there are all kinds of conversations happening right now around watermarks and other kind of visible signs on imagery to say this is real and this is not, and to block what gets pushed forward and what gets downplayed based on algorithms. And I think those conversations are, as best I can tell, somewhat in their infancy right now, though they're going to have to move a little bit faster to keep up with, to your point, I think where this technology is going to go.
I think this is a really cool time where these sorts of conversations are happening about regulation, about policy making around good use of AI and criminal use of AI and how those can be enforced. I don't think it's just the news industry that's going through these. Law enforcement is going through this. Politicians are going through this. Policymakers are going through this. So you can look at it two ways. You can look at it as a time where there's just a lot of chaos, or you can look at it as a time where we're having consequential, interesting, super cool conversations that are going to lead to, better ways of dealing with a tool that we've just begun to understand as a society, not as an industry. Like you said, we've been using AI for other things for a long time, but as a society, it's so new to us and so strange. But it's an adventure.
I've got a small daughter, and I was recently thinking, it actually makes me a bit sad that I'm going to have to teach her at some point to not trust what she sees on first sight. Do you think that's where we're going?
Hey, Malcolm X said that long time before I was born, that you don't believe everything you read in the newspapers, right? So that was always a good rule, is to be a savvy consumer of the media. I will do, as a journalist, I will do the best that I can to give you the most accurate, fair, and independent information that I can. It's still up to you to decide whether you're going to take it. And if you're a savvy consumer, you will see what I've done, and you will make your decision. But you should always approach newspapers and television channels and websites and journalism with critical eye, because we do that on our end as journalists. So why not you as a consumer of what we make?
Yeah, I worry about it when you're looking at a TikTok. You're looking at scrolling through TikTok things, and here's some serious news, here's some entertainment, here's some serious news. Are people, that's the question. As a news consumer, I mean, you can say yes, you can put responsibility on them, but do you think that people really care these days? I know that's a horrible thing to ask.
I'd
and
like to believe yes,
I'm
otherwise
hurting
what are we
myself
doing
as a
here?
journalist. I'm hurting myself. But do you think that, do you have faith in the young generation coming through that that is what they want? They want the truth, really.
I actually do. I mean, I think that one of the kind of interesting dynamics that you've seen with TikTok and with Instagram and some of these other platforms that have emerged for younger audiences is, I mean, there are a couple of things I would point to. One, you've seen a bit of a backlash against accounts that are really solely driven by kind of product placement, right? When there's a sort of a clear financial motivation behind the person whose account that is. You've seen sort of a turnabout there, which I think gets to kind of trust and independence, which I think is really positive. But again, I also think about the positive of why people have gravitated toward some TikTokers or kind of social media, influencers who are focused and doing kind of reporting and real news. It's because they see themselves in that coverage, right?
Absolutely.
They think the perspective represents what they're after more than what they've seen in traditional media. And to me, that is still people seeking information, still people seeking accurate information, still people wanting to go out and find out what's happening in the world. But it's a challenge for us to say, how do we make them see themselves and their perspective in what we're doing? I really do think there's a link there. I don't think it has to be a one or the other
right.
choice here.
You're absolutely right. I think millennials and Gen Zs and folks younger than they are way smarter than us. I mean, think of it. We've really screwed up the world. My parents, not me. And they're the ones who are tasked with fixing it. They have to be way smarter than us in order to do that. And I have no choice but to be optimistic about them being better news consumers than we are. Again, my dad shares disinformation on the family WhatsApp group. There's not a single Gen Z cousin or friend or coworker who has done that. They're a lot more critical of consuming information than we are. But also, I also think the rise in the consumption of TikTok and all these platforms that younger people are using is forcing us as news organizations to be better, to sort of overcome a certain level of skepticism that we haven't encountered before, and also speak to people meet people where they are on the platforms that they are on, and speak to them in a language that they speak to each other. And I think that is the way to do it. I think sort of, wouldn't we be replicating our parents' mistakes if we said, these young people, they're on TikTok, we're gone, we're lost. They're never going to be as smart of a news consumer as we were. it's totally not the case. They're way smarter than we are.
Well, that's a positive note to end on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.